You're listening to another episode of Rig Recon Live. I'm Bruce Quick alongside Jason Whitmire. You can get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube. Make sure you follow us on social media at Rig Recon. You can find us on Facebook or Instagram. And then most importantly, visit our website, rigrecon.com, for all the latest apparatus content, including product comparisons, product guides, and so much more. Make sure you catch up on all the latest episodes too of Rig Recon Live. We have a lot of great episodes out. We're fully into season 2 now. And today we're joined by Chief Ed Rice. And then Jason, I know you'll introduce the topic and talk a little more about Ed for us. So take it away.
Thanks, Bruce. First of all, thank you very much, Chief Rice, for joining us today. I go back pretty far with Chief Rice. We've worked together on a few projects over the years. We've worked together on some famous things. I'm not going to go through your history. All I'm going to do is point out for the audience that you've been doing this for a long time. I'll let you go through your history. But I want to congratulate you on your retirement, which is recent. And it's something that everyone in life has to earn. And I know you have truly earned it. So if you want to go ahead, Chief Rice, and just give us an introduction on your background, your history in the industry for our audience.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jason and Bruce. I'm Ed Rice. I just recently retired from the District of Columbia Fire and EMS Department back in January. I served there for a little over 28 years. I retired as the Deputy Chief of the Fire Apparatus Division there. So I've been involved with the apparatus in D.C. Probably since the late 90s. Started out as a union committee member and then progressed into the fire department side and eventually chaired the committee for a few years. And then it ended up working at the apparatus division after that for the last 3 years plus that I was there. So I've had a lot of experience with this. It's a very large fleet. We experienced a lot of issues, and some of those things we'll touch on today in our discussions.
Thank you. So,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Bruce, I didn't mean to cut you off, but our subject matter today, we're going to specifically talk about incidents involving fire trucks and ambulances. And, the background here is we all know a fire truck, very large vehicle, sometimes driving at a decent rate of speed. Let's face the facts, they're on their way to an emergency. Even an ambulance, smaller vehicle, but still potentially traveling at a higher rate of speed, still a heavier vehicle than most people are used to. We're going to approach this a little bit from the professional fire service, where they're blessed to have drivers who have a little more training than us in the volunteer service. In the volunteer service, there's not a lot that goes in. Hopefully the individual fire companies take it upon themselves to train well, but there's not a lot that goes into it. I mean, in most states in this country, you don't need anything other than someone's blessing to hop behind the wheel of a 50-ton or a 50,000 pound, I should say, vehicle and go tooling around with that thing. So we're going to talk about some of what happens when you do have an accident from the standpoint of what kind of questions are you going to be asked? What kind of maintenance records are they going to look at? How's it going to affect your department? One thing I just wanted to say for our audience up front, some of the subjects we're going to touch on today could have involved a bad accident where someone's life was lost, whether it was the life of a firefighter, an EMT, or someone from the public who was driving a vehicle. We're not trying to make light of that. We're not trying to brush over that. Any loss of life is tragic. We're just talking here today from the other side of how it affects other things. We all know that the primary thing it affects is that family that was involved. And we just want to make sure we address that up front, that we're not glossing over that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And thanks, Jason, for starting us with the topic. So, Chief, before we get too deep into things, let's start maybe with the apparatus design. Are there any things to consider, where you can prep your vehicle for an accident? Maybe it's a reinforced bumper, common components, or even hinged versus roll-up doors.
So when you start talking about the bumpers, Bruce, one thing that is kind of misleading, you see a lot of these new apparatus with the steel bumper, but what really goes into that steel bumper is the structure that's behind it. As far as support, it could just be a piece of C-channel frame rail, basically, that's put out front there, but there's no structural support behind it to brace it and to reinforce it in the, the event of an accident. A lot of apparatus accidents, you'll notice, they impact the right and left front radiuses of the cab area and that area of the front bumper, as because they're intersection accidents. Not too often it's a head-on hit. So the structure that's behind those outboard of the frame rails, right and left side, definitely needs to be beefed up back there if that's what you're looking to do with that front bumper. One thing in the last order of apparatus starting in 2017 that we did was put what we called a tail whacker on the pumpers and on the back of the tractor drawn ladders and the rescue squads. And it's basically a substructure of steel that drops off the rear of the frame rail and then goes out and supports around the left rear, right rear, and across the center rear of the vehicle. So it kind of starts a little bit beyond that rear axle, works its way to the rear of the rig, and then straight across the rear. And a lot of times you'll see fire apparatus are involved in backing accidents. It's just like the cost of doing business. Even with a backup person back there, you still end up having these backing accidents, even though they're not supposed to happen, they do. And anyway, also fire apparatus more and more seem to be involved in rear end collisions where they are getting rear ended while parked on the street. I don't think anybody really understands the exact cause of what is going on there and why that has become something very recent. There's a lot of arguments out there as to the chevron striping, the brightness of the LED lights, and the road conditions and weather conditions at the time. But anyway, we found that to be pretty beneficial so far in some of the vehicles that were rear-ended, as well as vehicles involved in the front end collisions, with having that structural support behind that steel bumper.
So these are things you're talking about from a fleet management standpoint to try and keep the vehicle in service, to make it easier to get back in service. Everyone should keep trying. Your OEM, from their standpoint, they're only worried probably about one main thing, and that's survivability of the crash for the interior crew. So it takes the input of people like Chief Rice and the rest of these people in fleets to really stress to the OEM, we also need to look at how we can keep this vehicle in service and keep it alive going forward.
Yes. Another thing, I think everybody, it's pretty easy to see if you go back in time and you look at some photographs of apparatus, not even that far back, maybe the 70s, 80s, 90s is kind of when the flip started to this larger type of pumper and aerial devices, where everybody was trying to make it a vehicle that would respond to any type of emergency there is. A perfect example might be the rescue pumpers, rescue engine, or a squad, depending on where you are and what you call it. These vehicles have a very high center of gravity, and they're very large, and they carry a lot of tools and appliances, water and hose, etc. And the weights are very critical. I don't think enough people pay attention to the weights, and it's not uncommon that an apparatus will sneak out of a factory, maybe being borderline or possibly overweight on either the front or rear axle. And that, coupled with a very high center of gravity, can cause the catastrophic incidents that happen to the apparatus. And I think one of the more common rollover deals is when they hit a soft shoulder. They go off the edge of a road on a narrow road where there's a soft shoulder, and that creates the rollovers when somebody overcorrects trying to get back onto the hard surface.
From a maintenance standpoint, or from damage caused to your fire station standpoint, did you have any? We talk about hinge versus roll up a lot because obviously one of the companies we work with is ROM, and that's our roll up doors. So obviously by default we're defendants of the roll up door, but just from your standpoint,
So,
hinge
we
versus
kind
roll
of
up.
we kind of shied away from the roll up doors. We experimented with them at different times. And kind of what happens with the roll up doors is the dirt and grit and from the roads was getting in them, and it created some problems as far as operating issues. And then we tried them painted and unpainted, and
Sure.
you know, there's issues with the paint sometimes with when the door coils up and after they're older and they start damaging the paint. And then another thing that was happening with the roll up compartment doors, if somebody was doing some work in the firehouse, checking tools and appliances, etc., and there was a rollout tray, if a rollout tray was left open and a run comes in, it was pretty easy for somebody to, even though there is compartment door alarms, the adrenaline's flowing and people rush out the door and that tray is still open. With the compartment door being a roll up, you don't see it as much when you check the mirrors. Then we used hinge doors primarily, and the doors were hinged in such a way that the forward door would slam itself closed if it hit the door opening, and then the rearward door, it would just snap the door closure and fold it back against the fire truck.
So
that
so
was-
by design you built in that you made a little less damage to the station.
Right. We weren't using lift up doors. There
Right.
was an experiment with some lift up doors on high sides on engines at one time, and it can create some catastrophic damage to the fire truck as well as the building.
Sure.
So we used the vertically hinged versus horizontally hinged high side doors.
So as we progress through our discussion here towards the accident part of this, let's start talking about some of the causes of accidents. And we touched on this a little bit already. Everyone automatically assumes, oh, it's a fire truck that was going fast, so it must have been the speed. And I think those of us in the industry know that it's not always the speed. Speed can clearly be a contributing factor, but in your experience in the incidents you've been involved in, can you talk a little bit about pros and cons, or if there's rumors out there you want to dispel about speed in general?
Actually, you bring up a great point there, Jason, as far as the lights and the siren in general. When the public sees a fire apparatus or an ambulance or even a police car responding down a roadway, the lights and sirens, for some reason, air horns, etc., just make the vehicle seem like it's going faster than it actually is. Most of the departments now, whether it's police, fire, EMS, they all have multiple forms of tracking the speeds of vehicles, whether it's through onboard diagnostics, a computer-aided dispatch system that's using GPS. There's various forms and very redundant, and they can usually track it a couple different ways. But when you investigate some of these accidents, and a couple times over accidents being involved with investigations with the safety office and whatnot, the speeds were found to be well within the realm or borderline of where the apparatus should have been traveling at the time. And it just, for some reason, makes it look like they're going much faster than they really are.
Yeah, that's always been a big thing in my experience. Something knowledge base for our audience. So the NFPA code, and I know you're involved in the NFPA board, or you have been for a long time. The NFPA code, in my opinion, it was good intention several years ago when they implemented some top speeds, but maybe not the best implementation, because it seems like a lot of the accidents we have, especially the rollover accidents, they're not necessarily because a vehicle was going too fast overall. So just so everybody knows, we limited vehicles to 68 miles per hour if they're under, I think the cutoff's 50,000 pounds. Chief, is
Yeah,
that correct?
I
And
believe so.
if they're over 50,000 pounds, we limited them to 60 miles per hour. But a lot of these rollover incidents we see on something like a tanker, it's not because they were going 70 miles per hour. It's because they were going 40 miles per hour, which is well under the speed limit, but into a curve that was rated for 25 miles per hour. So it wasn't necessarily the top speed. Would you agree or want to expand or disagree with that type of statement?
Yeah, to your point, the top speed is probably not the most critical factor. Like mentioned earlier, road conditions create a lot of these problems with those rollovers. The perfect example you just mentioned was a tanker going into a curve, and then it ends up on a self shoulder and tries to correct, and then that's when the catastrophic incident happens. After that, sometimes tires can present a problem due to the age of the tires and whatnot. Um, so that also is an issue. And the tires are kind of interesting because there's some rules out there as far as tires are concerned, as far as age limits and how long they can be on an apparatus and whatnot. So that becomes problematic because if you look at that tire, you know, the average person's going to think, wow, there's nothing really wrong with that tire. But apparently there's some changes with tire technology now where radial tires do this thing called delaminating, which they kind of come apart similar to what an older style retreaded tire will come apart. And it's basically due to dry rot and age. So that's another critical thing that if you look inside the tire tread, you'll notice that you'll see a little bit of dry rot sometimes when there's plenty of tread left on the tire, but that's a key indicator that you really do need to replace your tires.
Were you involved in any accidents that were caused by a tire coming apart?
No, I was not.
So just so everyone knows,
I've seen tires. You'll see them on the roadway. I had an incident with a personal vehicle that a radial tire delaminated, driving on I-95 one time. And, it's like, wow, it's not a pleasant experience.
we touched on this a little bit in a podcast we did last year on NFPA codes, and it is 7 years. You got to replace your tires.
Yep.
And it's not 7 years from the date you put the rig in service. It's based on a date code on that tire. So a lot of times it's not just as simple. I don't know why we like to make everything complicated, but it's not just as simple. Like we don't stamp a date on the tire. Instead, there's a letter on the tire. And when I say we, it's not us. It's the tire manufacturer.
Yes.
The thing you have to be careful of, and everyone needs to keep in mind, is we get a long lead on trucks right now. If that truck's in production for 1.5 to 2 years, that tire could have been built and sitting on a shelf, and now it's put on the rig, and you could take delivery of a truck that is a tire that's already 3 years old. Not an ounce of wear on it, but
and the tire could have been sitting for a year before it was shipped to the manufacturer to mount it on a wheel too. So that it is very much cause for concern.
Yeah, I want to go. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say the weights again and center of gravity. As the apparatus gets larger, that center of gravity goes up much higher, and you have front to rear versus lateral side to side. And there are some guided information in NFPA about the side to side percentages for weights and front to rear percentages for weights as guidelines for people to follow. And it just doesn't always happen.
Before we jump to Bruce's question, just you bring something up that's interesting that I think we should point out for the audience. A lot of people, when they see a truck with a lot of water, they think of something like a tanker on the road like a milk truck. A milk truck can't have baffles in it because of the fact that they need to clean the inside of that tank down so that bacteria doesn't grow and get caught in the crevices. On a fire truck, whether it's a big 3,000-gallon elliptical tanker or just a 1,000-gallon pumper, there is heavy baffling inside that tank. So you don't get the slosh, they call it, of the water shifting as much as you would in an over-the-road truck tanker.
Correct. But the center of gravity is what my point was, is it's much higher. You don't have that sloshing back and forth, but with that weight point being significantly higher off the road, that's what can lead to that the rollover, so to speak.
Sure.
You're not low to the ground.
Yeah, so I want to go maybe overall big picture here, and then I think we can break down some of the bullet points we came up with. But
Sure.
when an apparatus is in an accident, what goes into backfilling that fleet? What goes into that from an overall standpoint?
So typically, I mean, a realistic way of looking at it is, if you have an accident and you lose an apparatus, it's out of service, you're pretty much taking two pieces of apparatus out of your fleet because you're going to have to replace it with a reserve. So not only did you lose one out of your frontline fleet, you've lost one out of your reserve to bring your frontline fleet up to where it should be for minimum levels. And then a lot of times the reserves are not in the best of condition age-wise. They're older. It presents some training issues depending on the members of that company that are operating that vehicle. If they've ever had to operate an older style apparatus, if they're newer members of the department, they might not be familiar with it and have to be trained on it. You get into some issues. Some departments have what you might term a ready reserve, which is fully equipped and not really have to transfer equipment over. And then the other departments have to transfer all their equipment from one rig to another rig to make it fully functional again. It just depends if the department has a cache of tools and appliances available to them to do that.
Which, of course, gets expensive.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. Very expensive. Inflation has impacted all aspects of life in general, whether it's food or tools and appliances, vehicles, whatever you've purchased in the last few years, inflation has impacted that purchase price.
I'll give the audience a great real world example of what you're talking about with training. So back in the day, your throttle on your engine turned counterclockwise to increase it. Even the first governors that came out may have turned counterclockwise, but at some point we went to clockwise rotation to increase throttle on our pressure governors. And that became an issue for some people because their frontline service truck that they were all trained on went clockwise, but then they got out on scene with a reserve and they started spinning that dial clockwise and nothing's happening. And they're saying it's broken. It's a training issue because that older truck might have been counterclockwise. So just an example of what Chief Rice is talking about with training.
Yeah, and to paint maybe a picture of how inconvenient it can be, what are some of the older apparatus you've seen in reserve fleets?
It was not that. We just recently, prior to my leaving, we had some 2003 era vehicles that were still in service. And there were some ladder trucks back to about 2000. I think every major metropolitan area in the United States right now is facing some of the same fleet concerns with the long lead times of trying to replace apparatus. The rising costs creates budgetary issues. It's just like, it's this multifaceted problem that everybody is struggling with right now, trying to figure it out. So you have these old reserves that need to be replaced, and frontline fleets that need to roll back to being reserves. They all have age on them now. And, depending on what you order, who you order it from right now, you're probably facing a lead time, which Jason talked about earlier. It could be anywhere from 2 to 4+ years right now, depending on the type of vehicle and the manufacturer. And then you get into these budgetary issues, where the price today, could be X, and the price a couple of years from now is going to be Y or Z, based on, what happens to, the producer price index and the consumer price index over the next few years. So it's a real interesting problem, and, it's receiving a lot of pushback, really. And it's a very awkward situation for all involved.
For sure.
Another issue, like, to back up a little bit, Bruce, about accidents. So a lot of municipal governments, if it's a large municipal government, is self-insured. And that creates another problem with the reserves as well. Because accident damage doesn't always get fixed. If it's accident damage and the vehicle can remain in service, it's just going to keep on doing what it's supposed to do and have a few battle scars. If it's some kind of incident that puts the apparatus out of service, a lot of times that self-insured issue creates a problem with local monies that are available, because the accidents aren't really budgeted for by self-insured organizations. So you may have to wait to another budget cycle to program that spending in to be able to, get the accident damage fixed. And, the lead time on getting parts is also an issue now too. It's the same as ordering a new vehicle, how long it takes you to get the parts, where you are in line in the body shop or the facility that's going to repair the apparatus. So you have all these constraints,
You touched on something interesting there. There's been a lot of stuff in the news the last few months, and I know you've heard some of the discussions about people waiting long for parts, waiting long lead times on trucks in general, and just how expensive they've gotten. One of the things I want to point out on parts, people start to push and say, I want non-proprietary parts. Great point. But a lot of times the things you're not waiting on a push-pull handle. You're not waiting on a valve. You're not waiting on a gauge. It's the corner portion of the cab that Chief Rice talked about earlier. When that gets damaged, it's the door, which could be custom to your body because of the exact height and width of it. Those are the things that have to get built. No one is sitting with those things in stock. Big department might be sitting with a few of them in stock, but my point is, it's not like a big OEM has every body door they've ever built just sitting on a shelf ready to go. They have to build that. In order to build that, they have to get production to schedule it. Well,
Right.
That's going to just put another delay on those new trucks that are coming out.
Sure. I mean, that one thing that a lot of people probably aren't aware of is what goes into that whole process, from the time a manufacturer would get a purchase order for those parts to order them, and then it has to get programmed into their system, and then it's basically in a queue as to when that, for example, a compartment door that has to be built, or a cab door. The cab doors are fairly reasonable because of the size of the doors. They're not, as random as a compartment
Right?
door.
They're a little more common.
Yes. But the compartment doors, like you said, it gets put in a queue, and then it goes into the manufacturing process. And, if you've toured any of the facilities, you know what it takes, what it starts at as a piece of sheet metal, and how it gets cut and formed and bent and shaped. And then it goes to paint, and, before it actually comes out. So
Well,
it's
and you
a process.
touched on another good point there with the self-insurance is my volunteer fire department gets in an accident. I probably have a turnaround in a day or two from the insurance company approving the repair, and then I order that part. I'm sure you had a little bit of red tape you had to jump through at a big department that's self-insured, so you could be delaying the process even further till they approve that repair.
Yes, and it was not uncommon to, with some of them would end up in, the legal system and in court, and the accidents would be a couple years old before the court hearing would even take place. So, there's that hurdle to leap over too, as far as all the documentation and keeping files and whatnot, and keeping all the accurate information.
So far we've touched on some great subjects. We've touched on what goes into the vehicle, what goes into some of these incidents and why can they happen, how hard is it to get that vehicle back in service. The things that I think we really want to hammer home for our audience and give them a little insight. As a chief of a department, most people don't sit and think, I got to prepare for an accident. I got to get ready for this. That first time that an accident occurs, I'm sure that chief, if he's never been involved in it before, his head's spinning. He's getting phone calls from public relations, from press, from insurance companies, from his own department. Your experience, you have a wealth of experience because you were in a big fleet for a long time and involved in some accidents. Anything you could say to our audience to think about and maybe prepare yourself for?
In an urban environment, accidents involving apparatus are probably more common than people think they are. There's involvement with law enforcement. The best thing you can do is pretty much like put together a little accident package and keep it in the vehicle, and you can create a drill in the smaller volunteer departments, or depending on what size your department is, make sure everybody's aware of the things that need to happen as far as police reports, if there's injured members having to be transported. All the larger departments always have a policy concerning accidents, and it's in the, written rules and regulations and in their books and whatnot of what has to take place and how an accident gets handled and who has to be notified. But, the smaller departments, they should have an accident policy available to their members. If you don't have one, I suggest you write one and keep it available. It doesn't have to be something super complicated. It could be, who in the department needs to be notified, notify the police department for a report if there's injuries, how the injuries have to be documented, and all the notifications that need to be made and how they're handled. If towing's required, what needs to be done, then towing impacts are huge sometimes with apparatus accidents, as far as how the apparatus could be picked up, transported, and that all depends on the severity of the damage as well. But you really just need to prepare yourself and have like a written policy of how you're going to handle it. If you're not self-insured, make sure the insurance cards, the owner's cards, all that information concerning the vehicle that needs to be on the vehicle is on it. If you're self-insured, you're going to need the self-insurance documents from your municipal government to have it on that vehicle too. But put that package together and, keep it in a map box or a glove box, etc. And it simplifies the process, as well as having that policy there also that somebody can quickly follow it in, when those emergencies do happen.
I know you're involved in at least one apparatus on apparatus incident.
Right.
I don't recall if you were involved in any fatal accidents.
No.
But can you talk just from that? Apparatus on apparatus is a big deal because I know that gets more press than just a fire truck versus a car. People look at fire truck versus fire truck and say, look, these dummies hit each other, which is a terrible way to think about it because they were both going to do a life-saving effort. but can you talk a little bit about what goes into the investigation? What kind of questions are, as a fleet manager, are you asked certain questions that you should be prepared for? Are there documents or records that you need to make sure you're keeping properly? Things like that.
Sure. Part of that investigation with a major accident like that, a lot of police departments, and if your local police department doesn't have it, your state police most likely does, has a major crash division. It'd be well worthwhile if the police don't call for that major crash to ask for major crash to come out and do the investigation. Um, they're definitely going to ask for maintenance records for that vehicle, going back for a period of time. It could be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, et cetera, or the lifespan of the vehicle, to determine if there is any type of repetitive problem with that vehicle. Um, you know, they're going to ask for, all those records to determine like how old the tires were, when the tires might have been put on, when the last time brakes were put on the vehicle. They're going to take measurements. They'll probably weigh the vehicle to figure out certain things there. After the accident, say just for an example, if it's an engine, they're going to try and figure out, what the water level was on it, whether it was full, half full, or, did the tank get damaged and all the water leak out after the accident, those types of things. But a major crash division is going to do a very thorough investigation of an accident. You don't need to use major crash for a minor type accident, but a large accident, like with two apparatus, definitely contact major crash. A lot of times they happen at an intersection, believe it or not. Other times they might just sideswipe each other at the scene of an incident, which is sometimes not that uncommon with tight streets and things like that. That doesn't really have the need for, a major crash incident investigation. But, a catastrophic accident with two apparatus, just using an intersection, for example, it's probably a good idea if there's severe damage to have major crash do the investigation.
Focusing off of major incidents for a moment, just something that pops into my head. When it comes to minor incidents, you just talk about something that's common. We're trying to jam two large vehicles on a small street to put out a fire, and we bump. Like, not bump at high speed, but you couldn't fit, and you tried to fit it, and you caught something. What were some of the most common things that you see damaged when that happens?
A lot of times mirror strikes are the biggest thing. Depending on if you use rub rails and whatnot, depending on the type of rub rails. And if you use a rubber cushion to mount the rub rails, that can save you a little bit of damage, even with side swiping cars. A lot of times cities have rear alleys, and they put position apparatus in the rear alleys to take a rear position. There's a lot of things in a rear alley that get in the way, whether it's trees, light poles, trash cans, you name it. So there's a lot of things that just happen. I mean, for lack of a better term, it's the cost of doing business, but a mirror strike is probably the most common, as the cabs have gotten wider over the years, and will most likely, rumor has it, they might get a little bit more wide with the new engines that are on the way. The mirrors stick out further and further, and also it presents a problem, in the Mid-Atlantic and up through the East Coast, moving north. A lot of the buildings are old, the firehouses are old, and people have to fold mirrors in to get in and out of the firehouse. So wider cabs are definitely going to be an issue there as well. But the mirror strike is by far the most common.
I kind of, in my mind, I kind of assume that, but you're the expert on it, and I wanted to hear if I was
I
making.
don't know if it's an expert, but there was a particular manufacturer that used a certain mirror that was manufactured by one group, and during the period when all these issues with supply chain were going on, and relatively so still going on. They had a fire in their factory, and you couldn't get their mirrors till there just wasn't any production of that style mirror. And it was a problem we had with ambulances, not so much the fire apparatus, but with ambulances, with a particular style of mirror that was on that chassis. There was just a lot of crazy things that were happening over the last few years, that I don't think anybody, lack of a better term, could make it up.
Something I wanted to touch on, and it kind of leads into accidents at times, but fire trucks are fun to drive. Ambulances can be fun to drive, and they have meds on them sometimes that people think might be accessible. Have you had any experience with theft of vehicles?
More so ambulances. Thefts on the fire truck was usually for tools and appliances out of the rear of the cab or a compartment. Saws were in DC. Saws were, I don't know what the deal was, but like the people knew exactly what compartments they were in on the ladder trucks. And, there was video of quite a few of the thefts, and, they knew which compartment to go to, and they were done, and, we did have to put padlocks on the doors and lock the doors, etc. But they still tried, even though the doors were locked. Ambulances were much more common getting stolen. There were secure idle features that we put on all the ambulances. And a lot of times, you go back to the training thing as the rollover of older employees to newer employees, as members of the department. You get into that whole training thing, and people just weren't using these secure idle features, and it allowed ambulance thefts to occur, but they were more common. Sometimes it was a matter of somebody in the back of the ambulance getting up into the front of the ambulance and taking off and driving it away too, with what turned into law enforcement issues after that with, the police involved, whether it was members involved in some type of scuffle with the patient or whatnot, and for their own safety, getting out of the way.
I think one of my favorite ambulance theft stories was ambulance took someone to the hospital, and they were treated. Don't even know the story, what they were treated for, what the incident was, but afterwards they said, "Give me a ride home." And the ambulance crew was like, "Well, we don't do that. We brought you here, but we can't bring you home." So they hung outside the apparatus bay at the hospital, and when the next ambulance came in, when they took their patient in, they stole the ambulance.
I remember
They were asked, "Why'd you steal the ambulance?" "They wouldn't take me home."
Yeah. I think it was somewhere down in the South, if my memory's correct. But there was a recent ambulance theft in DC, where the person got in the ambulance. They weren't the actual patient, but another patient, and drove it to a health clinic and wouldn't get serviced in the health clinic, and then drove it to a hospital emergency room after that. But whatever is going on with that individual, they definitely knew they needed an ambulance, and thought they needed an ambulance, but drove it to a health clinic, and the dash cams on the vehicle, recorded it all. So, it's just very interesting how these things happen. And I don't know that anybody really understands why, but, the ambulances seem much more popular in an urban environment, as well as getting taken from the hospitals too.
Yeah. So to just wrap it up for our audience on that subject, there are devices out there.
Yes.
This is just proof that we're not all about selling on Rig Recon, because It's not a device that Safe Fleet makes, but there
Yeah.
are anti-theft devices out there for your fire
Oh,
truck.
absolutely. Sure. You can have, you can lock the cab doors and have keyless entry into the cab doors with the engine running, and somebody in theory should not be able to get into the cab. There's secure idle features on the ambulances. The ambulance theft is probably a little bit more common because it's a commercial chassis and it has a keyed ignition. Um, People probably aren't as familiar with, exactly how to start a fire truck based on, there's a couple steps you have to do to get it started and running if it's shut down. Um, they're just not familiar with putting a key in and turning the key.
Right.
So, but, getting people to follow the steps necessary to engage the secure idle features is probably a huge part of the problem with ambulance thefts.
Yeah, well, I think another great episode today. And as we sort of wrap it up, I think we've talked through a lot of great points here. But Chief, maybe if you could just summarize kind of overall, maybe your top things to consider in preventing accidents and then managing when they do inevitably happen.
Uh, Probably the best thing is, the drivers. You have to remember, you're responsible for the people on the apparatus as well as, the environment that you're driving in, what your road conditions are, what the weather conditions are, um, and be cognizant of the responsibilities you have to get everybody there safely. If you don't get there and arrive at the incident, you're really not going to have an impact on uh, mitigating that incident. And if you're involved in an incident on the way, then you have to call for help to help mitigate the incident you were involved in. But that's probably the biggest thing is, be aware of your road conditions, being aware of the condition of the vehicle and, the weather conditions, your responsibility for the crew that's on board with you and their safety, and drive, in a responsible manner.
Great point.
Yeah, so again, this wraps up another episode of Rig Recon Live. Chief, we really appreciate your time today and giving us your wealth of information. Make sure you catch this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, follow us on social media, and visit our website, rigrecon.com. Until then, expect the best.